If and if-else statements are used for choosing whether or not you want to do something. I'm guessing most people have seen them, but there's some interesting subtleties to point out. This shows a simple if statement. It will evaluate the condition, and if the value is true, it will do the stuff inside the then block. If the value is not true, it will skip the code in the then block. Writing conditions is a bit of an art. If you need help with the logical and relational operators, check out the video link above. So, you use an if statement when you're choosing whether or not to do something. If you are choosing between two behaviors, then you want an if-else statement like this. It will evaluate the condition, and if it evaluates to true, it will run the code in the then block. But if the condition is false, it will run the code in the else block. So an if-else statement is used when you are choosing between two behaviors. So much for the overview of these statements. Let's get into the interesting subtleties. First, there's some debate about whether or not you need the curly brackets. The rule is that exactly one statement is considered to be inside the if statement. So, if you only have one thing to do, you don't have to have the curly brackets. Since my example only had the one print statement, I could have left the curly brackets off. When you need to do more than one thing inside the if, the curly brackets wrap up what you need to do to make them one compound statement. Those are the facts about the curly brackets, but good form says that you should always include the curly brackets. Your code isn't going to be written just once. Somebody else is going to have to add to it in the future. If you don't put the curly brackets, they might add their statement indented as if it were inside the if, but the compiler doesn't pay any attention to the indentation. In this one, that last statement will not be inside the if. If you always put the curly brackets, there's never a question about what the if holds. There's one other thing about that one statement inside the if rule. Look at this code. See that semicolon at the end of the first line? That's the one statement that is inside the if. The rest of the code is after the end of the if statement, and that printf will always execute. Yes, you can randomly add curly brackets and your compiler won't care. So, if you feel like the machine isn't evaluating your condition correctly because it keeps executing your then block, look for that semicolon. The muscle memory in our hands gets used to putting a semicolon at the end of every line, and in this case, it really isn't helping. We can put anything inside of these if statements, even more conditional statements. Pause the video and see what you think this code will output for each of these values in grade. Just be the machine. Execute the code from top to bottom. Here are the correct answers for you to check your work. One other thing related to those curly brackets. If you don't always include them, sometimes you can run into a situation called the dangling else problem. Look at this code. Humans reading this group the code based on the indentation. If we said age 20 and height was 65, it looks like it would say not a child. However, this is how the compiler will see that code. Remember, it ignores indentation. So our 20-year-old, who is under 6 feet tall, will see not a child, too young. Well, that's clearly not right. The rule is that an else statement is always paired with the closest if statement that does not yet have an else block. So in this case, the else gets paired with the if that is checking the height. I started this discussion saying it was related to curly brackets. Bottom line, if you always use all of the curly brackets, this will never happen to you. The curly brackets make which if and else belongs with indisputable. If we had put all of the curly brackets into our original code matching that weird indentation, it would have been clear that the else had to go with the first if. One other detail about those curly brackets. There's one case where it's better to leave some out. If you have an else that only contains an if statement, it is sometimes more readable if you leave out the else block's curly brackets and you put the if on the same line as the else. These are sometimes called if-else-if statements. This technique really makes a difference if you have a long sequence of conditions that are all checking the same variable. I've kind of skipped over one of the hardest things about writing if statements, composing those conditions that make them work. The video I've linked here will talk about relational and logical operators and how to use them to build complex conditions.